Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort, and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. So I'm pretty excited to be hosting Jeff Beeson today on the podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, because we connected on LinkedIn just a few weeks ago, and I was immediately intrigued by his changeover, his transition from being a research scientist to being a salesman and a developer of a new product. So I'm kind of fascinated by this, partly because I love working with scientists to help them tell their stories, and I know that we have that in common. So Jeff, the first thing I always ask is for you to tell me something that most people would know about you. And the reason I do that is because we're going to get into some pretty personal stories over the next few minutes to an hour. And I like the audience to have a better feel for who you are. And these stories are always interesting to me, and they definitely demonstrate something about my guest that helps people feel more connected to them. So what do you think?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. Really glad we could get connected and figure out the podcast pretty quickly. But as far as a fun fact that most people don't know about me, I guess it depends how long you've known me. Because if you've known me since I was a kid, this is not surprising. But if you've only known me professionally, this would be kind of an odd fact, which is that when I was growing up, my family would always go on these camping trips way up north in Minnesota. And these aren't like RV or like kind of like domesticated camping trips. This is like 6 hours up north, way on the border of Minnesota and Canada. Literally have to take a boat to get to the campsite, and you just like live on an island for a week.
Wow.
And the reason it would be surprising is because I am such a city person these days, and that camping just did not stick with me. It's nice to get out in the outdoors every now and again, but the city is definitely my default, whereas for most of the rest of my family, it's kind of the opposite, where like the city is the getaway for them, whereas nature is the getaway for me.
That's so funny. Wow. So you grew up in that area, in the Minneapolis area?
Yeah, I grew up just in a suburb, not too far away from the University of Minnesota, and have been in Minnesota most of my life. I just spent half a year in Europe, one semester in college, but beyond that, I was kind of born and raised in Minnesota.
But you're a city boy, really.
Yeah, definitely.
That's funny. So we're kind of opposites, because I grew up not camping. I hiked a lot because we lived in Colorado Springs when I was in junior high and high school. But basically, I was a city girl, and here we are in Montana. And
Yeah.
if you had told me 20 years ago that I'd be living in Montana, canning my own pickles, making homemade beef jerky, and hiking on a mountain almost every day with my dog, I would not have believed you.
Yeah, it's funny how life turns out like that, and who knows, maybe in 20 years I'll find myself in that position.
Well, you never know. I mean, I love to get my city fixes, though. It's kind of like your family. Like they come into the city to get a city fix and then go back to their area. But believe it or not, Helena, Montana, it is the capital of the state, and it feels more like a city than some of the other smaller cities in Montana. And we live in a house built in 1890, like 6 blocks away from the downtown area. So it's not really rural where I am, but it definitely feels like it when I'm 10 minutes up the mountain and I can't see another soul for miles and miles. So kind of a cool mix. So yeah, it's kind of a good mix between city and not city for us. And it's a small enough town that our boys were able to walk to the grocery store by themselves and ride their bikes to school. But it's a big enough town that we actually have a few decent restaurants and a couple of great museums and galleries. So it's kind of a good blend.
Cool. Yeah, sounds nice.
Yeah. So let's get into the meat of the conversation. What I'm really curious about is kind of specific experiences that you had in the last few years that made you realize that you could do more good in transitioning away from the research science into helping scientists communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have something specific?
Yeah, looking back, I can think of some specific things, but at the time, they didn't mean anything, and they were more confusing, if anything else, when they were happening. So,
That's not unusual.
no, no, not at all. So I think the main lesson I learned there is just to go through life doing the things that seem like the right choice, even if they don't make sense, and then looking back, you'll figure out how to craft the story from those experiences that didn't seem related at the time. So I guess just to give you a specific example of what I'm talking about there. A few years ago, I was working in a lab doing research on genetic engineering, which is kind of specializing in molecular biology at the time. For anyone who does know about science, I was working with a technology called TALENs, which was like the major gene editing tool before CRISPR-Cas9 came out. You might have heard about that on the news. But anyway, I enjoyed the science. It was very interesting. It's what I went to school for, so I felt like I was putting my degree to good use. But the lab is just a very lonely place to work. And I do feel like I'm naturally more on the introverted side, but there's enough of an extrovert in me where I wanted something else. And I didn't see that route within the lab. But I didn't want to abandon the lab altogether because I didn't know where else to go. So I actually took some inspiration from a lab mate of mine who, of all things, worked as a bartender at night. And I thought that was cool. She could work in the lab 9 to 5 and then nights and weekends put some extra cash in her pockets, doing something fun with nightlife. And, I kind of wanted to go down that route. Went off a little bit of a tangent, though, and ended up getting into DJing, of all things.
Cool.
But I have to thank a friend of mine who got me into that. I did not learn it by myself. I had some people show me the ropes. But basically, I kind of lived a double life for a few years where I'd work in the lab 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And then nights and weekends, I'd go make some extra cash as a DJ. And none of this made sense at the time. Like, I was just kind of enjoying life after college, thinking like they weren't related in any way. But then eventually it finally clicked where like I had been doing this side hustle for a few years, basically a form of entrepreneurship, being self-employed. And I finally realized that I had picked up a lot of skills in sales and marketing along the way. And I had always joked that I was better talking about science than doing the science itself, which didn't seem like a real job. And then it finally clicked. I should just go into scientific sales.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Did not make sense at all at the time, but then looking back, after doing it for years, I finally figured out how to like put these two different lives together.
That's not uncommon at all. My brother actually did almost exactly the same thing. I mean, he graduated from UC Santa Cruz with his degree in microbiology and molecular chemistry or something like that. And he ended up in the lab as well, but it didn't take him very long to realize that he was kind of lonely there and he definitely wanted more human interaction. Ended up going back to school to be a teacher. And now he is a social media consultant and he's been doing it for over a decade and he's awesome at it. So he's completely out of that scientific area. So it's interesting that you ended up finding a way to combine the two. So tell me about that first job. Did you see a job description or, how did that happen that you suddenly realized, oh, this would fit me perfectly?
I think it was from just paying more attention to the industry as a whole. I had kind of been focused on a specific career track within biology my first few years out of college. And then when I started to kind of get antsy in the lab and knew I wanted something else, I just took a step back and looked and tried to figure out what else was out there. And of course, the first things I saw were more traditional routes in science, like go back to grad school, become a professor, or, get a master's degree and become a lab manager. And then, I finally started paying attention to these sales reps who, I've been seeing in the lab, and kind of started asking them about their jobs, and eventually just started applying to postings I would see on Google and networking, and ended up landing something with a company called Stem Cell Technologies, which is actually the largest biotech company in Canada, and they were a fantastic company to work for. And they were my first real official sales job in science, finally combining these two worlds like I talked about.
Mm-hmm. So tell me how you found that job. Was it just some random thing, or did you know someone? Or
I did end up connecting with someone, but I just found it through Googling. I don't know how I came across it exactly, but started becoming pretty adamant about scientific sales. Stumbled across this company. Looking back, I don't know how I had never heard about them before, because they're really a big player. I guess my previous research experience just never really quite matched up with the products that they were offering, so they just kind of weren't really on my radar. But eventually I found them just looking online, and just fell in love with the company, and it was just kind of that aha moment, like I have to work for this company.
I love that. I love it when that happens.
Then started reaching out to people a bit like how you and I got connected almost, and found someone who we had some common connections, kind of asked him how he liked the job, and he ended up kind of coaching me through the interview process, and ended up landing the job. So that's someone else I have to thank for my journey.
Oh, good. Oh, good. So tell me about the interview. Because you had none of the experience that they were looking for, except that you had it, but not in that field. And that's often the difficulty in translation for an interviewer. So tell me about, you walk in the room, tell me about this.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I had to do was kind of ignore the fact that I didn't fit the stereotypical mold.
Right.
Flip the script and somehow turn my weaknesses into strengths. Because, having two jobs when I was working in the lab was not a strength at the time. I ended up being very conflicted and, overworked. But the thing I did demonstrate out of that was just hustle and grit, which is something that sales managers love to hire for. So I picked up on that. Figured out that they didn't necessarily want someone who was the most experienced or the most scientifically savvy, because the territory they wanted me in the Midwest was bigger than the other territories, and they just wanted someone who could kind of grind. So, working two jobs is a pretty good grind, and just kind of honed in on that, and I guess ended up convincing them.
So do you remember what the room looked like? I mean, was it in Canada? Did they fly you to Canada for this?
Yeah, it was a pretty extensive process where I, had an initial HR phone screening, and then had 3 different video interviews, and then after that went to Canada and had a full day of interviews there. So ultimately talked to I think about 13 different people, and the most intense was the last interview when I was speaking with the VP of sales, because she's been doing her job for a long time and she knows how to interview people very well.
Okay. So describe that.
Well, she just kind of called me out on my weaknesses. She said, well, you're pretty young for this job. I'm not convinced you're ready for it. Convince me. And that was the most intimidating interview question I had ever heard. And did not know
so you're
how to
sweating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was clearly not a question I'd prepared for. And this was actually towards the end of the interview, where I knew I was still kind of on the fence with him. So I just kind of tried to go for a home run and just went for a very personal answer. And
which was?
At the time, I was planning to propose to my girlfriend, and ended up bringing that up in the conversation, and just said, well, I need to be the kind of husband who provides for the family, and this is the kind of job that a husband has. And I just am determined to be successful at it because I, am making this big step in my personal life, and I need to take on something of equal maturity professionally. And I had no idea if that was going to work or not, but clearly it did.
Wow. That is an incredible answer, because what you did is you made it part of a story. You made that first job with them part of your story and demonstrated that to her.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to go for. I wasn't really thinking much at the time. The words just kind of came out of my mouth.
Well, clearly you made an impact, or you wouldn't have been hired for that job.
Yeah.
So what did her office look like? I mean, was it intimidating walking in?
Walking in, not so much. It was her and someone else high up in the sales team, one of the sales directors, and just sat down with them at a small round table in the office, so it wasn't kind of the intimidating, like, across the desk
Behind
from
the desk, right?
we were just sitting in in a triangle around a circular table, and it was just framed as sort of a discussion, so that alleviated the tensions at the beginning. But like I said, the questions were a bit more daunting.
Yeah. What other questions did they ask that really that you remember vividly? I mean, clearly that was a big one.
Yeah, clearly that was the big one. Gosh, I don't know. That one definitely jumps out most to my mind.
Right.
As far as I can remember, a lot of the other questions were, somewhat expected. Like, tell me about this experience, and how does that prepare you for this job? And yeah, I just, none of those really stick out in my mind because, like I said, I kind of went through the whole interview, like, never really making a strong impression either way, and I knew I was coming across as too neutral, so it all came down to that last question in my mind.
Wow, she definitely knows what she's doing then, to put you on the spot in a way that generates a story that matters to her.
Yeah.
Something that she really needed to hear. That's really impressive. Did you stay in touch with her in any way, or was it just such a big company that you ended up, that was the last time you ever really talked to her?
I mean, we would cross paths once in a while. I mean, she was a bit higher up in the organization. I think, she was like my boss's boss's boss. There were like one, two, like three people in between me and her. So, I mean, but I would see her once in a while, like at the biannual sales meeting, when they got all the sales reps from around the country together. But on a daily basis, no, didn't really.
Were there any other impressions that you got of her in terms of her style and leadership, and why she was so insightful to ask you that specific question?
Well, I think after some time at the company, I figured it out, because at the beginning, I was very intimidated by her. But after some time, after I'd met her in person more, after being with the company and meeting each other at sales meetings again, she's actually just very nice and personable. And I think my impression of her was that she's just very experienced, because she's been with the company for a super long time, and you can tell she takes a lot of pride in it. And through that experience, kind of knows, like, what makes a good sales rep and how to hire for one. And I think that's how she could just get to those poignant questions really quickly.
Sounds like you admire her.
Yeah, I definitely did look up to her.
Cool. I love hearing stories like that, because I've heard so many of the bad manager stories and the bad interview stories and the bad job stories. And it's always a relief to me to hear somebody who really better understands how to lead with that experience, knowledge, but also clearly she has a heart for it and a pride in what she does. So do you think you've learned anything as a result of that experience in terms of how you would manage or how you would interview somebody? Are you doing those tasks now?
I'm not really doing those tasks directly now. I mean, they've certainly come up at certain points. But yeah, I've definitely taken inspiration from her. Because like you said, she's someone that I look up to, and other managers along the way, and kind of figured out, like, what questions would I ask, or how would I get someone to tell their story? And I kind of agree with the style that she chose, which is not really caring so much about the superficial stuff on a resume, because anyone can put a document together and make it look nice on paper, but kind of asking someone to put some context to it in the actual interview, that's when you really get to know someone and ask, well, why do you do what you do? And then go a few layers deep. Not to be like annoying, but ask why until you finally get to that, like the core of the answer.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Jeff. And I'm guessing that that's what you do with your potential clients when you're selling. You kind of keep digging until you figure out what they're really looking for and whether you can provide that service.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've found to be true in scientific sales. I think a lot of other people come at it, not just in scientific sales, but just in general, business to business or B2B sales, that it has to be all technical and about the specifications. And I find almost always it's not. Because even though scientists are very data-driven people, they're emotional creatures at the end of the day. And the drivers behind their buying decisions are more emotional than you'd realize.
So like what? Can you give me an example of a specific buyer that you had that experience with?
Yeah, one pops out into my mind. I guess not to be overly specific and technical, but basically I was talking with a researcher who was not necessarily having issues with their protocol, but they were just kind of frustrated with how long it was taking. Mm-hmm. And obviously everyone wants to get their work done faster, but I kind of just got to know them a little bit more and figure out like why that was so important to them. Because some researchers don't mind taking a long time as long as like it gives you better results in the end. But this guy wasn't one of those. He just wanted to get things done fast. And the reason was because he had 4 kids and wife at home, and staying at work longer than he needed to just cut into that precious time that was obviously a priority for him. So with that in mind, I presented a product to him that was going to drastically make his experiments way shorter. And, things like, cost or the, implementation of a new protocol didn't really matter as much because he was kind of fixated on the time that he cared about on an emotional level.
Wow, that totally makes sense. How did you figure that out? I mean, what was the conversation like? Do you remember it?
I don't remember it specifically. I think it's just kind of one of those things in sales where you collectively put all the conversations together and eventually find a way to make sense of it. I mean, kind of like I was talking about earlier with my own story, like how it only makes sense when you look back at it, but at the time you don't really see how things are connected. So I think it just kind of come up that he's got 4 kids at home, and I just thought, oh, well, that's cool, just a personal fact. But then it wasn't until like the next meeting I had with him where I realized what that fact meant in the context of our relationship in terms of like salesman and customer.
Wow, Jeff, that is such an amazing connection to make. So you realize that now you're looking back. Are you trying to apply any of that to your current conversations? I mean, now that you've learned this about this particular client, are you asking questions differently in order to get to that point faster with other clients?
Well, I think one thing I'm doing differently is trying to be better at note taking. That's
yes.
I haven't been super great at, but I'm slowly getting better at it. The reason note taking is so important is because you never realize when these little bits of info are going to be important, and they're super easy to forget unless you have notes to look back on. So that's one thing I do differently now and continuously try to improve, to encourage other people to do as well. And yeah, I think another thing I do differently is just, frame the conversation differently. I think it's really easy as a salesperson to just talk about the features and benefits, like why you're the best business and why you should go with our product or service. But I try to come at it from a different angle, which is like, what are you trying to get? What's your ideal future? And hopefully I can help you get there. But if not, I can still make a recommendation. And I'm happy to provide recommendations to competitors if it turns out that I'm not the best solution, because at the end of the day, like I genuinely do want to help people. I want to help them get from their current state to their future state, and hopefully I can help bridge that gap.
Well, and it sounds like you're doing that pretty well. I'm still kind of holding on to that part of the conversation where you connected those dots and put it together in a way that made sense for your client. It's just, and you're right, taking notes is so important. It wouldn't be important if you were only talking to 2 or 3 clients a week. But when you're talking to 2 or 3 or 8 clients in a day, having those personal notes about how many kids they have and what kind of dog they have and where do they live and, what are their interests. If you're in a genuine place of curiosity, it's amazing how that can help you build that relationship, and it'll be long term. This isn't a short term sales relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, I actually kind of want to challenge something you said in there, like talking to 8 clients a day. I think that's another thing that I sort of disagreed with like traditional B2B sales, is you need to talk to as many people as possible. And I found that to be overly draining and not really contributing to results, because people say that 80% of your results come from 20% of your effort. So really, spending unnecessary time with customers who are just kind of kicking the tires and never really going to buy is taking away from the relationships that really do matter. So I'd rather focus on the people who I can help the most and develop that relationship even deeper, as opposed to spreading myself thin and then just kind of helping everyone on an average level. I'd rather help a few people as best I can, as opposed to a few people just okay.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And it actually speaks directly to some things that I've been talking to other people about recently, in terms of making sure you're using your strengths in your work. And your strength is clearly building relationships. And there are other salespeople that making 30 calls in a day isn't going to be draining for them, because that's who they are. It's how they work. And they may get 3 clients out of the 20 people they talk to, where you're going to talk to 6 and you're going to get 4.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think
it's just different.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes calling 30 people a day is the way to go if you're selling something that's more of a commodity and like with slim margins. But what I prefer to focus on is kind of that specialty product, sort of like the luxury good within the scientific realm, as opposed to something that can just be mass manufactured and isn't that profitable.
Right. So clearly you are somebody who needs to not only feel connected to the product they're selling, but be able to understand the dynamics of that particular industry. So you're clearly in the right place for you.
I like to think so. It's a journey. I'm sure things will continuously evolve, and they won't make sense at the time, but I'll look back in 5 years trying to figure out how to make it all click. But still get one step at a time.
Well, that's the whole theme of this podcast, is looking back at those stories and figuring out where the patterns are and where the dots start to connect. And you just brought us right into it. You homed in on it immediately, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Because most people don't realize that there is that connection. And even when they look back, they don't necessarily connect those dots. So I'm really happy to have been able to talk to you about this, and the way that you've figured out how those dots connect. Not a lot of people do that.
Well, speaking of looking back, that's actually something I wanted to ask you about, because the reason your profile intrigued me in the first place, and the reason I kind of sent you a request on LinkedIn, was because I sort of saw a bit of myself in you. Because these days I don't actually work as a sales rep directly. I kind of transitioned into being a sales coach for smaller biotech companies. And I noticed what you were doing, being a communication coach. And I was really curious about your story and how you got to where you are, and I don't know what advice you might have for someone kind of stepping into that coaching role. Like, what are some lessons that you learned along the way that you might want to share with me?
Wow, turning the tables. Well, let's see. Probably the first thing I would encourage you to do is make sure that as you're having these conversations, as you're coaching people, that you are listening to your own ideas for lessons for yourself. So
Mhm.
what I found in those first couple of years of coaching was that I was learning an awful lot about myself during these coaching sessions that made me a better coach later.
Mhm.
Um, I would call them my aha moments in coaching. And I would encourage any coach to also have a coach.
Mhm.
Um, I read a book, my friend Arminda Lindsay sent me a book after our first session when she coached me. And it was about the fact that if you don't have a coach, how are you um, demonstrating the value of coaching?
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's something that isn't really, I don't know, appreciated as much. I never really appreciated the value of coaches until I started getting coaching and then realized that that's what I want to do as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's, if I didn't value going and listening to live music, then how could I perform and expect other people to value my live music?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's an expectation thing. But where I was going was that if I'm having these aha moments when I'm coaching somebody, I need somebody to process those moments with
Hmm.
so that I can better understand where they're coming from.
Hmm.
So that would be my first thing. And how I got into it, I think most coaches get into it because they're already coaching in some aspect of their lives,
Hmm.
and they just end up making it their primary job eventually.
Hmm.
So I don't know a whole lot of people that go into coaching that weren't already mentors throughout their lives, that weren't the people that others came to for guidance and advice and to talk to.
Hmm.
I think it's kind of a natural thing, an instinctive thing that people know when they can come to somebody else and open up and be vulnerable.
Hmm.
And if you're the person that people generally come to, then this might be a good fit for you.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what you're saying definitely resonates with me because that's sort of how I got into coaching. I mean, even from a young age, like my mom always pointed out that I liked sharing knowledge with other people and teaching them things. Even as a kid, I always come home so excited to teach what what I learned at school that day. And even throughout my life, I was always the person who wanted to like help train other coworkers or just help friends out with their businesses. And you know, my mom always said I should be a teacher, and I guess in some sense that came true because I do think a coach is a type of teacher.
Oh, definitely. So, as a kid, did people come to you and ask you for advice and ask you to help them?
Um, I suppose sometimes, like I was always happy to answer questions with homework if other kids were struggling or whatever. Um, and even if I wasn't necessarily the best in a subject, like I remember helping tutor one of my friends with organic chemistry, which is not my strong suit. OChem was kind of out there for me. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
having
That's a
studied,
hard class.
my brother always kind of teased me about it because that was one of his strong suits. But I found that even in that case, I enjoyed tutoring my friends or well, my roommate at the time because it kind of kept me accountable, and I realized that it was easier to be accountable to someone else than it was to myself, and I didn't
Mhm.
necessarily have to be light years ahead of them. I just had to be one chapter ahead of them, and I could still offer something of value.
Well, I
And
definitely find that when we teach, we learn more deeply
yeah,
any topic.
yeah, and that's one thing I really enjoy about it.
Well, there is a pitfall to coaching in that way. And it's something that I've been learning over the years that I would always encourage other coaches to consider is that in a recent coaching training that I took, that I traveled to go take, one of the differences between a coach and an advisor is that a coach generally asks a lot of questions to help the person come up with their own solutions and conclusions.
Hmm.
And an advisor, of course, is somebody that people come to for advice specifically. Tell me what I should do. And even an advisor sometimes has to back off their own judgments and their own ideas in order to make sure that they are helping that person come to the right conclusions for them. Mm-hmm. And I have a hard time with that, honestly. I mean, I know I'm a good coach for most people, but there are times where my advice monster comes out. And I just, that was a phrase that Whitney Johnson used on my podcast a few weeks ago. The advice monster comes out with her adult children. And I do find that sometimes I have to, as a coach, back off and listen more and ask more questions, because it's really tempting to say, well, of course, here's the answer. Mm-hmm. And I would say that some of the worst coaches are the ones that don't take that into account and don't learn about themselves as they're coaching and realize that that is a really important aspect of it.
Yeah, definitely. I would just add to that by saying that I think when the advice monster comes out, it's not only oftentimes annoying to the person getting coached, because it feels like being talked at as opposed to like talked
exactly.
with.
Mm-hmm.
It's also not really advantageous to their learning, because even though it's a more difficult learning process, it's much more memorable and the lesson sticks if you come to the conclusion yourself. And I saw this in university a lot. There's like a trend in higher education these days moving away from passive learning, like the traditional lecture hall, to active learning, where the professor is more of a facilitator as opposed to a lecturer. And I think that's kind of the point you're trying to make here, is that you should really facilitate learning as opposed to, dictating it.
Exactly. And it really depends on the person. I mean, I can tell you, when I worked with the university system here in Montana, there were some faculty that really, they just wanted you to give them 3 options and let them pick. Mm-hmm. And then there were other faculty that really wanted to talk through things and participate and come up with a variety of solutions. So as a coach, I think it's our job, whether you're coaching in communication or sales or life coaching, I think our job is really to observe our client and figure out what their need is, because it's going to be very different from your own. I know my need is always for somebody to help me process things, where if somebody tells me what to do and gives me advice, I'm pretty much going to shut it down. I can't help myself. It's I don't know if it's the Aries in me or the middle child or whatever it is. I have a tendency to shut it down when I get unwanted advice. But I've also learned sometimes that when I ask for advice, I need to actually listen. And that's, again, it's all a matter of learning about yourself in order to be able to be the best coach to others.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something to be taken on a case-by-case basis. So my main takeaway is I really like the coach versus advisor point you made. And I suppose I see it as sort of a spectrum, where sometimes you're more of a coach, asking the questions, helping the learner discover those lessons themselves. And sometimes you need to be more of an advisor, just being that expert opinion to tell them what to do. But, most of the time it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And it depends on the person in the situation, and of course, whether they asked for advice or not.
That's absolutely. I think that's sometimes the hardest thing, is not giving advice when somebody doesn't ask for it. You can ask my little sister about that. She hears a lot from me. So, and my mother probably more than she should. That's funny. Well, Jeff, I am so grateful that you took this time to visit with me today. It's been really interesting, partly because I love that transition that you made, knowing yourself, knowing that you needed more external conversation than what you were getting in the lab. And I think you're going to make a terrific coach. You probably are already a terrific coach, and you're just going to get better and better, because if you can figure out how to connect those dots for yourself, you'll be able to help others connect those dots as well. It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me, and I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, and would not at all be opposed to doing something like this again in the future.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to follow up on this maybe in 6 months or a year and see where you are with this and what you've learned and where you've connected other dots with your potential clients and your current clients.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, I will have some information about Jeff on the blog post associated with this podcast on elkinsconsulting.com, including a link so that you can reach out to him and ask him more questions or maybe connect with him on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Right now, LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch and learn about what I'm doing. Once again, the name is Jeff Beeson, last name spelled Bisen, but I just go by Jeff B for short, much easier.
Well, I don't know. Beeson's not so hard.
It's often mispronounced as Bison or Bison, so I thought the letter would be the way to go.
That's probably a good idea. All right, Jeff, thank you so much, and I look forward to catching up with you again in the very near future.
Great, thank you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com. Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that?